Welcome back to Unplug with Mel. I'm your host, Mel Mosier. And today we have a moving and inspiring episode. Today's guest is Jason Tuttle, a father who turned his grief into a powerful legacy. After experiencing the heartbreaking loss of his son, Zachary, Jason found a way to channel his pain into something beautiful. A coloring book created in Zachary's honor. In this episode, we explore how Jason used creativity as a tool for healing and how he transformed his grief into a tribute that helps others. This conversation is a testament to the power of love, resilience, and the art in the face of an imaginable loss. This is also a trigger warning. Do not listen to this episode if it is too much. Come back to it when you can. But if you're experiencing grief in this very moment, we hope that Jason's story can shed some type of hope in the midst of grief. Grab a seat and listen in as Jason shares his incredible journey of turning sorrow into strength. Let's dive into this heartfelt conversation with Jason Tuttle. Welcome, Jason, to Unplug with Mel. I'm so glad that we're doing this today. On our podcast, we tell our story to inspire infinite growth, and you have an amazing story that deals with grief and what we do during that grief and what kind of happens afterwards. And so we met in a Facebook group where we're fellow podcasters. And we just began to connect, I guess, and collaborate. And so I let you tell everyone who you are, and then we get right into our questions on this podcast. So, Jason, take it away.
Well, first of all, thank you for having me on. I do sincerely appreciate it. As you said, my name is Jason Tuttle. I am a married father of two special needs kids. I've been married. This year will be 21 years. My background is in education. I taught elementary school physical education for 9 years before I left. At that point, I left to become a stay-at-home parent of my two medically fragile children, where I did that for 12 years up until my son passed away in January of 2022. And since then, outside of the topics that we're going to talk about today, I have gotten back into education.
Great. So the first question that we talk about in this, of course, talking about Zachary 2 years after his passing, and things have changed, and the dedication that you had for both your children is, tell us in that journey, some setbacks and what you were going through, and just kind of give a little bio of it all, of how it led you to where you are today.
Okay, so when my wife and I got married, I was 26 and she was 29. So we were a little bit more on the older side when we got married and decided we wanted to have a family. And we always wanted to have a family. My wife is from the Northeast and a cradle Catholic, and like most of her family is one of like 8 or 9. So she has a massive family. Even though I'm not born in the South, I'm basically Southern because I've lived in it almost all my life. And my side's always been kind of a small family. If you remember the movie My Big Fat Greek Wedding, and the wedding scene where one side's filled all the way to the end and the other side's like 4 rows, that was literally our wedding. It was the exact same picture. So, we got married, and about a year after we got married, we decided that we wanted to start having kids. And, my wife jokingly said she wanted to have X number of kids by this age. And I said, okay, I'm okay with that. And we started trying to have a child, and it didn't take my wife long to get pregnant. At least from the moment that we found out she was pregnant, we had no real concerns of any medical issues, anything popping up. Like, there wasn't a history of a Down syndrome or cerebral palsy or anything like that in our family that we knew of. Um, and the irony of all of that is the fact that uh, in the beginning, through all this, my father got big into ancestry.com. And so he went back multiple generations, and there was no indication that there were any medical issues or, any of our family members passing because of any of said medical issues. And even on my wife's side, we had no reason to believe that there was anything that was going to pop up. So we get through the first trimester and we start getting into, I believe it was the second trimester, where you get to that week 20 appointment, where you find out the sex of the child. And, we both went in there. We were happy to go in because, the running joke between my wife and us, she didn't want to know because, that's kind of one of life's last surprises. And I wanted to know just because I was a planner and I was the one that put the nursery together. And it kind of came down to the fact that I just didn't want to paint in neutral colors. I wanted to cater it a little more to the gender of the child. And so we get into the ultrasound appointment, where the tech kind of does her routine, and we're going back and forth. And the tech gets to the point where she says, I'm almost to the point that I'm going to find out the gender of your child. Do you want to know? And my wife and I kind of play back and forth. And before we can finish, she goes, well, I found an issue. I need to know the sex of your child. At that point, we immediately said, yes, we want to know the gender. And she said, well, you're having a boy. And I said, can you tell us what the issue is? And she looks at us and says, well, that's kind of a doctor relayed message. And I said, okay. I said, well, can you tell me the reason why you need to know the sex of the child? She said, well, if it's what I think it is, she said, it's rare in boys, but even rarer in girls. And I went, okay. So from that point, from week 20 all the way up until the point that she had her C-section, which was week 38, if I remember correctly, we saw a perinatologist, which is basically a high-risk OBGYN because medical issues have come up before the birth. And we saw one of those doctors. And through those, I believe the next 16 to 18 weeks, it seemed like every time we went, they told us every possible major issue that might happen. As scary as it sounded, I mean, they told us your son was going to be born with one kidney, which was true. Your son was probably going to be born with water on the brain, which is called hydrocephalus, which that did not happen. Your son's going to be born with areas of missing white matter in his brain, which that did happen. And there were two or three other like big issues that they told us about. So we get through those next weeks, and then we get to the point that my son is delivered. That day he's born, we see him for about 30 seconds, and then they whisk him off to the ICU at that hospital. And it was from that point we found out about his neurological issues. We found out about his rare condition. The next day, the local children's hospital, which is on the north side of Atlanta from me, actually sent their transport team down to come get him, to take him up to there because they were more equipped to deal with whatever his issues were at that moment. So he got transferred up to the local children's hospital. And from that point, he was in there for the next 12 days until we finally brought our son home. And it was at that point kind of the journey began, if you will.
So in the whole of that point, because this is 14 years ago now, right?
Let's see, he a little over 15.
About 15 years. You get the diagnosis. Now you have the baby. You're coming home with him. What's happening in this process? Is that when you decided to stay home full time at that point? Were you still teaching and your wife working? What was the dynamic going on, and how were you guys enduring that?
Well, I taught for probably the next 2 years. One of the positives about it was the elementary school I was at that time. One of the mothers, which I knew really well, and I taught, like, she was Mormon, and so she had like 6 kids. So I taught several of her kids. And I forget how it came about. Either my mother told her or she overheard or something. And she found me one day and she said, I know you're having an issue and you don't really want to put your son in daycare. She said, I live literally a stone's throw from the school. She said, I don't mind watching him while you're in work. And she said, then he'll be in my home. You won't have to necessarily worry about your typical illnesses going around in a daycare because he's got medical needs, that kind of thing. And so I was very fortunate with that. And I mean, at least on the financial end, I mean, she charged me a tenth of what it would have cost to watch my son, especially with medical needs. So we did that then. And then I want to say that next year for school, it was 15 years ago, and my parents were younger. And so my parents watched them that next year. And it was in that next year, about halfway through that year. No, may have been 3 years. So that next year, and I forget who watched them that last year, but that last year I was in about midway through the year, it just finally got to a point where I was in and out of the hospital so much that I was essentially working for free because I'd burned through all my sick time, all my personal leave, FMLA, that kind of thing. And so one day at one of my breaks, I called my wife from my phone and I said, hey, we'd always talked about me staying at home. What are your thoughts on it? And so she goes, well, they always say that for something like this, you just got to kind of rip the Band-Aid off. You can't necessarily prepare for it because if you're trying to prepare for it, you'll never be prepared. And I'll never forget it. It was a Wednesday of that week. I literally walked up and put my resignation on my principal's desk while she was out that Friday morning. And so I'm teaching a class, and because I'm at the far end of the building, I have a radio on me. And towards the latter part of the day, I'll never forget, I hear the office call me. They go, Coach? And I said, yes. They said, Principal so-and-so would like to see you. And I said, well, what is this in regards to? And all I heard was, you know what this is in regards to. And so I went up there and I said, are you surprised? She said, well, I'm not surprised that you resigning. She said, I am surprised kind of at the speed in which you're doing it. And I said, well, I'm just one of those people that when I make a decision, I don't look back. And so she's just like, would you need another week? I said, no. I said, I will be packed up and out of my office before you leave today. And that's exactly what happened. So I stayed at home at that point for the next 12 years. And in the beginning, the irony of all of this, and I've since kind of thought back, both of us were experiencing grief well before the grief that we're currently experiencing, just because we went from, having what we thought was going to be a child that had normal issues and normal everyday things and just the normal parenting stuff to grieving a life we thought we were going to have to a life that we are having. And it was in, people these days, at least before my son passed, they would always come up to me or my wife and say, well, y'all make it look so easy. And I said, well, right now it looks easy. But in those first 5 years or 6 years, I said, there were many a day that I wanted to go out my garage and just, punch a hole through the drywall because, all these things were popping up and all these secondary issues were popping up that I didn't know what they were. I didn't know how to handle them. I didn't know what to do for them. So,
I mean, he was your first kid, so it wasn't even like you had practice being parents.
yeah. And
So it's a
that's
whole new ball game at that. And
exactly.
I'm glad you touched on the fact of that you're grieving in real time of
Mm-hmm.
what could have been or should have been.
Yeah.
But a diagnosis is something new. A diagnosis is a formalizing a definition of what someone has or what life is doing in that real time. So,
Mm-hmm.
what is the actual diagnosis for those listening that your son had?
Well, I'll start with the ones everybody knows. My son was diagnosed with severe developmental delays, meaning when he passed away at 15, he was actually functioning 4 to 6 years old. He was diagnosed with epilepsy, which means he had seizures. He experienced grand mal seizures and complex partial seizures. He was also nonverbal. We believe that had something to do with neurological issues that he had. Um, He could army crawl like crazy, but like to walk on his own without assistance, no. He was, in that sense, he was wheelchair bound. Um, we had worked on him his entire life to try to get him to walk on his own, but again, we felt like the neurological issues were the driving force on him not walking. And then the rare condition was a condition called Eagle Barrett syndrome. It's also affectionately known as prune belly. And the reason why it's called that is because my son was born without any core abdominal muscle, not the front or the sides or the bottom. So all of his organs there were just kind of floating there, meaning I could lay him on the floor, and the only thing protecting his organs from the outside world was his skin. And up under the skin, there's a white kind of a mesh looking substance called fascia that holds the skin together and holds all that kind of in place. And that was it. Like I could lay him on the floor and I could literally from the outside, I could touch his large intestine, his small intestine, one of his stomach, one of his kidneys, his bladder, everything in that area I could point out, almost like one of those biology dummies you see in class.
Mm.
And
You mentioned your daughter is also special needs.
yes,
Does she have the same thing?
she has everything my son does except for the rare condition. So she's got severe neurological delays, epilepsy, she's nonverbal, basically wheelchair bound.
So when y'all are, getting diagnosed with Zach and
Uh-huh.
then your daughter, at that point, with everyone doing the ancestry and genetic
Mhm.
testing, is it something that you and your wife carried?
Um, Not the initial testing. When it came to that, no, there was nothing. However, we've been doing genetic testing now for probably 11 years. And after my son had passed away, well, before he passed away, we had gotten through another round of genetic testing and something had popped up, but they weren't sure what it was. And they tested both me and my wife. And they found out that one of the genes for whatever this new thing that popped up, my wife was a carrier for, is the reason why it popped up. Now, at this point, we don't know what it is. We think it's one of those gene deletion kind of conditions, or uh, I don't want to say disorders, but that's the word that's coming to my brain. Right now, as we know it, not only is he the number one case to our geneticist at Emory Genetics, we believe he's the number one case in the world.
Oh, wow.
Because there's a through Emory Genetics and a lot of these genetic institutes, they've got kind of a database worldwide. And so, like, there's a team in Denmark and I think England that were working together that they had something similar. It was like gene deletion ABC12A, but we are gene deletion ABC12B. And so that's the reason why they say that we may be case number one when it comes to that.
Oh,
Although we haven't heard anything in a very long while. I mean, all of the geneticists have literally said to us, never in the history of genetics has there ever been a genetic emergency. And so, literally, every time we do a test, there's an 8-week wait.
oh, wow.
So, it's a long wait.
Well, you've been raising Zachary for a bit, and then you get pregnant with your daughter. What's the age gap between the two of them?
Almost 2 years to the day.
So in the people making comments that you make it look easy, you were raising two special needs children at that time.
We
5 or 6.
were, and at least in the first 6 months, our daughter was, and I hate to say it this way, but she was the normal one. Because in the beginning, we weren't seeing any signs. And we later found out through some testing that she was delayed, which honestly, in the moment, I didn't want to hear because I just had so much going on at that point. We talked to our pediatrician who has a special needs child. And her comment to us was, if you're basing your daughter's development on your son, she's going to look normal. But the reality is, based on a normal scale that we all follow, she is delayed. And it was at that point that we started seeing a neurologist and we did MRIs and CT scans and you name it for
So
her.
here you are going through testing in hospitals again
Mhm.
within 2 years of, the same old at that point. And that probably made it even harder with the grief and anger and all the other feelings and emotions that you could feel and tired, just plain out exhausting.
Yes. From almost day one, I started having sleeping issues because over the years, like we kept, like even in my daughter's room now, I still have like a baby monitor there so I can hear. And we do that just because, like with my son, there were several times I literally bolted out of bed, came in his room, got him dressed, and raced him to the hospital. And from those points forward, I never really slept soundly. And to this day, I still have sleeping issues. If I don't have the medicinal help through my doctor that I have, I would have a very hard time sleeping.
Let's move into more of Zach's story
Okay.
here, and if you're ready for this, because
Sure.
we've talked off site here a little bit of the day that Zachary passed away. And for those listening, this is the truth of his story here. This is why he has letters to Zachary, is because Zachary's passed away. And it was an ordinary day for you guys. And then all of a sudden
Sure.
you saw the signs that something was amiss.
hmm
So let's lean into that here.
Okay, so for the listeners to understand, before my son passed, in his room, I literally had a wall of medical equipment, and when he was very susceptible to respiratory related viruses, so when he would get sick, there was just certain sounds and coughs that when I heard them, I immediately started kind of my protocol. And it was literally 5 different respiratory related machines. And I mean, I won't get into all the detail, but my son didn't particularly care for him, but it was what kept him out of the hospital. So with that being said, 3 days before everything happened, I'd sent both my kids to school. They came home and I did my normal routine. I got them both in. I lifted them out of their wheelchairs. I got them in their, loungewear. They played for a while I cooked dinner. I fed them. And then typically I would put my daughter to bed first and I'd keep my son up for about another hour just to give him some one-on-one time with my wife and I, because I love my daughter, but my daughter can be intense. And even my son would used to look at me at times and go, I just need a break from her. And so we would give him the one-on-one time. So that night I fed him one of his favorite things. He ate like a horse. I brought him into the bedroom. My wife and I would land both ends of the bed and he would lay in between us and we'd just goof off with him for about an hour. Everything was fine at that point. And so my wife went to go get the electric toothbrush to brush his teeth. And he liked it because he had sensory issues and he liked the vibrations. And so she went in and he threw up a little bit. And I didn't think much about it. I just figured she kind of hit his gag reflex and something was there and it just came up. So we cleaned him up, continued brushing his teeth, put him to bed that night. And, I looked at my wife. I said, well, maybe he's kind of getting a 24-hour virus, which he'd gotten several times in his life. We didn't think much about it. And I said, well, we'll listen overnight. And if he's not well in the morning, I'll keep him home because I was staying at home at that point. And we said, okay. Well, that night he was up and down all night, which is unusual for him because he was always a good sleeper. Got my daughter up the next morning, sent her off to school, texted his teacher, said, hey, Zach's not feeling well. I'm going to keep him home. I don't know if he's contagious. I don't want to spread anything. If he's better on Friday, I'll send him in. Great, fine. Well, that next day he was up and he refused to take a nap all day long. I kept telling him, I'm just like, buddy, you're not missing anything. Daddy's just going to be on his laptop on the couch. Uh, Daddy's not going to be doing anything interesting. And so he was watching one of his favorite programs, but he absolutely did not want to go to sleep. And one of the first things that struck me was he didn't really want to drink a whole lot on that Thursday, which didn't really strike me that first day, but I put it in the back of my brain just in case if on that next day he decided to not drink, then I would have gone, wait a minute, he didn't really want to drink yesterday. He's not drinking today. What's going on? Because one day without fluids is not a big deal, but when you start getting multiple days, you start getting concerned. So that evening on that second day, we put him down to bed at the same time as his sister. Gets quiet immediately. And so we just figure he's exhausted. He'd been up for like 20 something hours without ever sleeping. We thought, he's just tired. I told my wife, I said, I'm going to keep him home another day because that was going to be a Friday. We were butting up to a weekend. I said, if worse comes to worse, he's sick, we've got the whole weekend to get through. And then I'll reassess on Monday, see if I want to send him back. So we get up that next morning, get my daughter on her way. And then we give my son till about the normal time we get him up on the weekend, which is about 8:30, 9 o'clock. And I walk in there, and typically when I would walk in there, he would bounce and all that, and be excited to see me or his mother. And so he was awake and he looked at us, but he didn't really bounce, and he looked like he was kind of lethargic, but I mean he was still aware, and it wasn't to the point that I thought, hey, something's really wrong. It was just like, something's going on. I don't know what it is. And I walk over to his right side, and he's got a dark green streak of just fluid that had come out of his mouth. And I stop and I look at him, and for what I know in medicine and what I've seen on medical dramas, that kind of thing, I go, well, the only thing green that comes out of your body is bile. And I said, first of all, that's not good. And second of all, it's really not good that it's coming out of his mouth. So I get him up, and he's floppy, like he can't hold himself up. And even that didn't strike me because I had one or two times where he was really sick with like a respiratory virus where that happened. And so I get him out in the living room. I do all my protocol and all that. Nothing seems to be working. And it was literally just a hunch. I went, I'm going to take him up to the children's hospital. I'm saying this to my wife. And I said, something's not right. I can't figure it out. And I said, worst comes to worst, we'll get in there. He'll get admitted. He'll be in there for, his typical 7 to 10 days. We'll come home. Wife was working at home at the time. She said, okay, just let me know. So I get him dressed, get him in his chair, get him in the van, and I do like 90 up to the hospital because I just don't know what's going on. And while we're going up there, I think he's like wanting to fall asleep and then wake back up. And I'm snapping my fingers at him the whole time because, kind of like a concussion, you never want someone to fall asleep right afterwards because of what could happen having to a brain injury right after if you fall asleep right after it. And so I'm snapping my fingers at him the whole way going, buddy, stay with me. Stay with me. I don't know what's going on. We're going to the hospital. We'll figure this out. Well, what I later realized after everything had happened was he was actually dying in the van. And I had no idea that that was happening. So we get through Atlanta, we get through into the hospital, we get into like the parking deck, and I get him out of that, and he's very floppy, like he really can't hold himself up. And this really catches my attention. So I get him in his chair, I get up to the ER, I surpass the line, and before I can say anything, like the security guard comes up to me as if to yell at me to say, you need to get in line. Why are you skipping everybody? And before he says anything, I went, I don't think he's breathing. I need help immediately. And he snaps his fingers at the nurse, and she comes over to me and she goes, come with me. And, I tell people all the time, I've been in this hospital 100 times, and this is the first time I've ever run at a full run back into the ER into a trauma room. And I didn't realize it in the moment, but later when I kind of reassessed in my brain what was going on, I remember the look she gave him. And it was that look that I went, something very serious is going on. So we get him into the trauma room, and instinctually I get him out of his chair. I put him on the table that's in there, and I back away because I want to be in there, and I'm hoping that they're going to let me stay in there because my son's not verbal. He can't talk to him. And so I can at least tell them what was going on beforehand. So it just so happens there's another trauma room that's right next to it. It's open. Nobody's in there. They let me kind of back off into there, but still be able to see everything. He gets in there. They immediately cut off his clothes. They immediately intubate him, which is putting a tube to get air into his lungs. They start doing chest compressions. I mean, they're like 30 people, like ants out of an anthill, just swarm in here, which was rather impressive in hindsight. Just so many people out of nowhere just came in this room. And so the head ER doc comes over to me and goes, down to the minute, to the best of your recollection, can you tell me how long he's been this way? And I tell her, and she goes, okay. She goes off, kind of barks orders at him, tell them like what she wants done. She comes back over to me and she goes, explain to me the scenario as to why you brought him up here. And I told her everything. She goes back over there and kind of barks orders at him again. and they keep doing it. Well, in this time, they've already started chest compressions, doing CPR. They'd been doing it for approximately about 10 minutes at this point. And no more than I looked over to him, they get the paddles out like to shock him back to life. They put the pads on him. I hear him yell clear, and they hit that button, and he literally raises off the table, just like you see on TV. Now, in my head, I'm watching the monitor with all the respiratory rate and the pulse and the heart rate and all that on there, because I'm so used to looking at it from the respiratory hospital stays I've been in there. And they shock them, and it literally it goes up once and it goes back down to what it was. And in my brain, even though I don't react to it, I go, he's not coming back. I just instinctually, when I saw that, I was just like, he's not coming back. And so they continue working on him for 45 more minutes. I mean, it was the longest time. And I later told the head ER doc, I said, TV shows don't do y'all justice. I said, no, I knew y'all were going to work on them for a long time, but I said, for almost a continuous hour, I never expected that. So, they shock them. They continue working on them. They keep, pumping like antibiotics in them, that kind of thing. And ultimately it comes down, they shock them like 4 more times. And it's the same result. And the head ER doc comes over to me and goes, well, we can shock him again. But she said, unfortunately, I think the result's going to be the same. And I said, well, there's a lot I know about his conditions. I said, but this is out of my wheelhouse. If you think it's professionally necessary, then do what you think is best. And so they do it again. Nothing happens. And she pronounces them. And, she offers her condolences. And as anyone would, I kind of turn and go into the open room, and I have a moment. And I mean, it's literally about 15 seconds. I have a moment, and I immediately clear it up. I compartmentalize, and I make a phone call to his mother. Now, understand that his mother at this point is working from home for a major company that I won't say its name, but everybody buys everything from it online, that you'll know who it is. And so she's doing logistics for them. And I call her and I said, how did I state it? I said, if you're on the phone with work, put it on mute. I said, are you sitting down? And she goes, why? And my wife thinks I'm telling her he's getting admitted, that he has whatever it is and he's getting help. I had to tell my wife that her son was dead on a table. I will never forget the sound she made after I told her that. So I tell her that, and I say, tell your boss, call your parents, because both of our parents live reasonably close to us. Have your parents drive you up. You're not in a state to drive. And so she does that. I call my mother and my parents because they'd watched them for years. Same kind of response. I'll never forget it. Now, in hindsight, my mother told me several months afterwards, she said, you were eerily calm when you called me, and it had to have only been minutes after he had passed away. And I said, well, I had to compartmentalize in that point. I said, because there was things I needed to do, and I had to be level-headed to be able to do it. And I said, as much as that sucks and as hard as it was, I had to be that way in that moment. And it wasn't necessarily a male or female thing. It was just, I was there. I needed information. I had to be able to get it. So
it's something in trauma there. Not to say that I've lost a child, but I was in the room when my dad passed away.
Yeah.
And I had people not there. So making phone calls or making that announcement, you have to switch something off in order to do that, just to dial the digits. And I'll never forget the day when, I hear the flatline sound and they start to unplug everything and they tell you the words, in condolence form, we're sorry for your loss, but he's passed away. And then you get, whether it is less than a minute or whatever, and you've got to shake it off, because if you sit in it, you can't make those phone calls. It becomes real. At this point, you're in imaginary land. It's happened.
Yep.
But now you've got this big to-do list. Take care of that. Don't worry about this.
Yep.
And I can get, and you're right, it's not male or female. It's just, you're there. Now you're in trauma mode. And everything like that. So now she's on her way, and
Yes.
family is aware of everything, and
Mhm.
so let's go into what happens after that, and when the grief set in that Zachary is
So, um, they pronounce him. I deal with the care team at the hospital, and I fire off like 10 or 12 rapid fire questions because, I mean, it was what anybody would want to know. Are you going to do an autopsy? If you are, why? What's the protocol? If you're not going to do an autopsy, why? What's the protocol? Um, if you do one, what's the turnaround time? When can I get my son home, like the funeral home? If you're not going to do one, whose information do I need to have so I can get the funeral home in contact with you so I can get them home? That type of stuff. And so they answer all those questions, and the ER doc she goes, take your time in here. She said, you can have as much time as you need. She said, no, we can't necessarily be here all day, but she said, take your time. And I said, well, his mother's on the way. I said, where we lived was about an hour from the hospital. I said, she's on her way. We're about an hour from the hospital. I said, but she is coming up. And they're just like, that's fine. You have nothing to worry about that. And so for an hour, I sat in that room by myself with my son on a table after he had been pronounced. And like I tell people, I said, one of the things that I noticed that I'll never forget is how quickly he got cold. After everything was said and done, they pronounced him, they stopped, all the machinery was turned off. Like he had maybe been there 10 minutes. And like I touched him, and it caught my attention how cold he was in that fast of amount of a time. And so there was that. And, I just sat there stroking his hair and talking to him. And I mean, even still in that moment, I wasn't emotional because I was just like, I've still got my wife coming in. I've still got my in laws coming in. I've still got other people coming in, that kind of thing. And so I'm sitting there waiting. And then his mother comes in, and she has what you would expect a response to be, and the in-laws, that kind of thing. And I kind of updated them on everything that was going on, and we were probably there about another hour. I will say one of the hardest things I ever had to do was when everything was said and done and we decided to go to come back to our side of Atlanta. I had to get all this cut off clothes, put it on his empty wheelchair, and wheel it through the hospital. And that was the hardest, probably 100 yards I ever had to walk.
That's when a family arrived with my dad, and
Mm-hmm.
and again, it's different when it's your own child, but I
Yep.
held it together, even with the chaplain and the doctors and
Yep.
the nurses and the forms and the questions, until I had to leave him there, knowing he was going to the morgue of a
Yep.
hospital.
Yep.
And my brother literally nearly had to carry me out
Yep.
of that stretch of hallway, because that's when it hit for me that
Mm-hmm.
we're not staying here with him. We're not bringing him home. He's not alert. He's not talking. He's gone.
Mm-hmm.
So y'all get out of the hospital. You make it back to your side of Atlanta.
Mm-hmm.
You have the funeral, and
Mm-hmm.
now you have a new life to live without Zachary. So how did Letters to Zachary begin?
So I'm a big proponent of counseling or therapy, whichever one people want to see. And I had literally just kind of stopped a season of counseling probably 2 weeks before. The issues I was working on, I felt like we'd worked through them, and I just didn't feel like I had enough to talk about for the hour session I was there. And so after everything had happened, I called her up and I just said, hey, I need an emergency session. I said, if you can fit me in anywhere, I would as soon as possible. I said, you'll understand when we meet. And so she was able to get me in that next week, and we talked. And so I'd been seeing her once a week for about 5 or 6 weeks. And she goes, have you ever thought about journaling? And I said, you know, I've said it to many people over the 2.5 years now. I've said, my response to her was, I don't know if I'm the greatest writer, and I just don't know if that's kind of my thing. I'll do something, but I don't know if journaling's it. And so she looks at me and she said, "Well, you don't necessarily have to do it right now." She said, "Just put it on the back burner, and if you decide at some point you want to." She said, you don't have to share it with anybody. She said, you can put it on your computer and delete it. You can print it out and burn it. You can just to get it off of you. And I said, okay. And that idea sat there probably 9 months after my son's passing. It was a good long while. And there was one day that I was watching either a Facebook reel or a video or something was in there, and I think it was a sad scene, and it caught my attention, and I just broke down uh, just watching it. And I opened up Word and traditional like Oxford English style writing a letter. I wrote the date, my son's name, dear Zachary, and I just started writing. And I probably wrote 2 pages at that point on that first one. And I just kind of verbally vomited on the page, if you will. And I did that several times a day for weeks, and then it got to be where it was just kind of once a day. And I mean, I still write them, but not as maybe as much as I did in the beginning. And I held on to them. I saved them for a long while because I didn't really know what I was going to do with them. And one day I got into a Facebook group that what is it? Parents who lost special needs children, which I was surprised I found because that's a very specific area of grief. And I got to know the admin in there, this woman, very well. And one day I asked her, I said, do you mind if I post one of my journal entries in there? And she said, no, we'd love to have it. We get so few men that actually want to post stuff, especially emotions related. We'd love to see it. So I posted in there, and right before I post it, in my brain I go, even though this is a quote unquote noble topic to be posting on, I have to be mentally prepared for the positive response and what could be negative response. And am I mentally prepared enough to deal with the negative response? And in my typical fashion, I just went, screw it, I'm going to post it anyway. And so I did. And I got a massively positive response. I got a lot of 99% women were responding to me. And your typical response was, we don't know each other. I've never told anybody what I deep down feel. And you have nailed exactly how I feel word for word in this letter. And I said, well, I appreciate it. It's inspired by my son. I'm glad it resonates with you, and then I can do something to help. And I just said, I appreciate it. And every time I would do it, I'd probably do it once a week. I got the same response. And it was in those first couple of weeks of posting that I went, I've got something here and I need to build on it. And I slowly started building on it. I started reaching out to grief people and asking them, just not necessarily for help in the sense of promoting it, but help in the sense of, well, if you did a page or you did a podcast, what worked for you? What are some of the things that you did that you kind of shied away from because it didn't work for you? And I took all those to heart and started putting all those on the Facebook page I was doing as a blogger. And at that point, I started building a following. It was getting to be like 30 and 40 people a day. I mean, it was really surprising me how many I was getting. And I mean, it built and built and built. And so in that process, initially the page, I had it just for men, just because I got so frustrated trying to find men that were willing to open up about grief, and maybe not my specific grief, but unfortunately losing a child. I wanted someone that could at least grasp the concept from the male point of view of losing a child, and I couldn't find it. And so I initially opened it up for men, but after I got to thinking, I was just like, well, I want a broader audience, so I need to open it up some more. And so then it kind of evolved into, well, it was men, but it's now anybody that has lost a mother, a parent, a spouse, a child, a sibling, you name it. And that worked out well for a while. And then I thought, I still need to evolve it a little more. And what it is today of all of these things is, it's going to sound crazy, but I opened it up to women. And people go, well, wasn't it already open to women? I said, it was. I said, but it was more to give women insight into how kind of a male grieves, to give them understanding so that when they're talking to their brother, their father, their spouse, they've got kind of an understanding of what kind of the thinking process is behind a man grieving versus a woman grieving. And so all of those three things are kind of where I'm at right now with this page.
So the page was formed, and you've been doing that for I guess it's the last like 18 months or so.
No, it's only 10.
Only 10 months. Wow.
Yeah,
And in
yeah.
this 10 months, the newest chapter of your life is that you recently published a coloring book in Zachary's honor, correct?
I did right there.
Oh, wow. So
So,
for the listeners, to get the questions answered in our time frame and stuff, his story that you're listening to is wow. It's a very short time span for some to go from the loss of a child to a full Facebook page in regards to his letters to his son to now a coloring book in his son's honor. It's a way of
mhm,
coloring grief, is
mhm,
how I took it when I learned of Jason's story.
mhm.
And I will put the link how to get this coloring book
Okay,
and on our notes and everything like that. So I've got a few other questions and stuff, and it ties to your journey altogether.
okay.
One of them is, how did your marriage handle all of this?
Um, I always tell people when I just kind of tell them about our story is the statistic initially that we found out a marriage that has one special needs child, the divorce rate is something like in the 70% area. And I joke with people all the time. I said, well, if it was 70%, I said, I had two. So what is it? I said, does it make it like 90% at that point? And after we had lost our son, I looked that up, and marriages that last after losing a child are it's in the 90 percentile. It's
I
it's
mean,
pretty
y'all are a statistic to be divorced. That's the likelihood. Like they're
yes.
like with the phenomenal of not one child, but two, and then the loss
Mm,
of that one of those children. It's specifically stamped the divorce papers today. So
mm,
I commend y'all.
mm-hmm,
And I'm a divorced parent, and I didn't lose a child, so
mm,
I I can understand how hard it must have been at certain times for you guys to give each other space
sure.
and to love each other the way. And she supports your journey with
Hmm,
letters to Zachary, and of course the
sure.
coloring book. So what do you guys? What did you guys do to hang in there together?
I mean we it's just basic support. I was the more outwardly vocal about it. Now, when I had my moments where I would, I would just lose it and cry. Was it out in public? No, it was always, almost always in the house. I wouldn't necessarily be that out in public, but between my wife and I, my wife was more the kind of quiet unto herself about it versus me, who I was more outwardly emotional about it. And so, there were many a nights we were sitting on our couch and I was watching something and she'd look over at me and she'd just see me just bawling because of, I saw something that reminded me of him, or maybe it was a medical scene that I saw and it just made me relive memories and that kind of thing. And my wife has gotten emotional about it. I have never seen it at this point. I mean, I'm not to say that she hasn't, but she's generally pretty unto herself when it comes to stuff like that, and that's fine. We we both had vastly different kind of relationships with our son. Mine was a little different because I was 24/7, 365 care. We had that bond. I was always at the hospital with him, that kind of thing, being the caregiver and the father. And then she had hers. So, she grieved in her way and I grieved in mine. I mean, we were we were there for each other when we needed it, but for the most part we kind of gave each other our space a lot of the time, just so that we could get it out on our own time.
Well, it's a brilliant way of doing things, because the way you grieve is the way Jason grieves. The
Hmm,
way I grieve is the way Mel grieves.
hmm,
And so I can see the same for your wife in that regards. But judging someone for how they grieve does
hmm.
no one any good. And
Oh
that's
no.
probably why divorce happens is, oh, you must have not, felt the same way I felt. And y'all had
Hmm,
different roles. And that's very smart
sure.
to understand, to same thing, anything in anyone's marriage. You have different roles.
Hmm,
The one's a primary caregiver, one's the breadwinner, or
hmm.
vice versa, and everything like this. But how did how did Zachary, letters to Zachary and stuff, influence how you grieved going forward? And have people reached out to you and you've, formed that bond to go through it together a little bit?
Sure. Initially for me, it was I'm one of those people that if I don't get it on my chest because of the ADD I deal with, I will internalize it and I will replay it 1,000 times in my head. It'll drive me crazy. So for me to be able to have an outlet, even if I never shared it from the first, for me to be able just to get it out on paper, and if I never did anything with it, I could at least just get it out. And then, I would still grieve, but it wouldn't necessarily be as heavy than just to keeping it in and just pile on top of each other to the point that it was just unbearable. Um, and then, a long time ago before my son passed away, I told myself instead of complaining about things, do something about it. And you know, I didn't immediately do it, but when I started seeing all the positive responses, I thought, well, I'm still going through grief, but if I can help someone while I'm going through it, and I've always been transparent about it, in that, hey, I'm still going through grief. I'm still going to have my rough moments. I'm still going to have my hard days, but if I'm farther along than you and I have some advice or knowledge to give to you, I will certainly pass it along and share the wealth, so to speak. And that was kind of where I went with it. And then my wife came into me a couple months ago and said, "You may not see it, but she said the fact that you've reached all these people has helped you out tremendously." And so, because even with what I'm currently doing now, I literally look at the page every day, my website every day, things with the book every day. So I am literally still 24/7 in grief. Granted, it's a tweaked version of it from the original, but I deal with grief literally most of the day, every day.
So you mentioned at the beginning of the podcast that you're back in education. So did you go back to work?
Well, yes, but not in the same field. I taught elementary school physical education, and in education, when you have to get certified through your state, and in probably most states, but in the state of Georgia, you once you get your certificate, you have 5 years to get renewed, and you can either go back to school like college to get a higher degree to earn those hours, or through the school system, you can earn continuing education credits and all that. And if you earn enough over 5 years, you get recertified. Well, I've been out so long that my certifications lapsed for me to teach PE. And I always knew that if I ever got back in education, I needed to either come in as a teacher's aide paraprofessional role or a sub, because I knew then the principal could learn my style. And if something were to come available, she would know me. And so I got back into the school system in a paraprofessional teacher's aide role. I am currently in a self-contained emotional behavior disorder classroom, which, for those that don't know anything about education, of all the rooms you could be in a self-contained room, it's probably the most intense room you can be in, just because of the emotions, the traumas, the everything associated to why a child may or may not be acting the way they are.
My son, my oldest son, is not like a special needs child in a sense like your son is, but mentally he has a diagnosis that makes him he would have been in a classroom like that
Mm-hmm.
20 years ago.
Uh-huh.
And because of emotions, not able to self-regulate
Mm-hmm.
and stuff like that. And still being somewhat developmentally delayed, that
Mm-hmm.
he looks like a grown man, but he's really just kind of like a teenager at this point.
Sure.
And so, yeah, very high volume, very intense feelings and emotions. And I see somehow with you that that's kind of where you need to be, because these kids need someone like you who's calm and patient and who can compartmentalize.
Yeah, it is. I will say, without not going into a whole lot of detail, the last several days have been rather intense in the room, just due to issues relating to the kids.
New school year.
I, I will say there are days it can be a lot. again, I'm not at the beginning of a grief, but even still with the underlying grief that I am dealing with and then dealing with all of their issues I come home, there are a lot of days I come home just exhausted.
Oh, I'm sure. I'm sure. I mean,
So,
I'm a mom to just one. I could not be put in a classroom of
yeah.
however many they are. And mine's now considered an adult, and there's some days that I'm exhausted.
Mhm.
So props to you for going back into education after all of this too, because
Sure.
it's a choice you made, but it wasn't a choice you had to do
Yeah.
and everything. My last thing on here before we wrap up and stuff is our listeners listening into this are listening for probably a purpose of grief. And if
Sure.
they are going through something right now, and what advice or quote would you give them to encourage them in their journey right now?
Well, just in my personality, I tend to be very open and some would say blunt. Um, I would say, despite what the world tells you, grief sucks. I mean, there's just no way around it. It's terrible. It's devastating. It's all of the adjectives you can think. And then I would say, don't let the world tell you how to grieve with your experiences or your situation when they've never dealt with it. Um, that's a lot of what I run into most days, especially. And the weird thing is, typically the worst people to grievers are people that are related to them. I get that more often than not, and I have told people many times over the years, some of the friendliest, most understanding people that I've ever run across are strangers on the internet, because they get it, they understand, they've with family, they've been there and done that, or they for the most part understand what you're going through. Maybe not exactly, but they have a good grasp of it. So, there are tribes out there are communities out there. You just got to look for them. Whether it be me as a male from just a different perspective, or from a female's perspective, there's probably 1,000 groups on Facebook that deal with grief, uh, for at least the female side. I The one thing I tell people when they make comments about everything that I've dealt with and the loss and tragedy, now I may be I may have heard this somewhere. I'd like to say it's my own, and I think it is, but I may be paraphrasing from somewhere else, so don't quote me on it. But typically, what I tell people when they make the comment about everything I've been through, I say, my consistent comment is, though it is the glory of the mountaintop in which I seek, it is the valley in which I live, and I learn to persevere. And I tell that because, yeah, we all want to have those great moments. We all want to have those fun times. But the reality is, more often than not, you're going to deal with adversity. You're going to deal with it. And, where you're currently at is where you have to deal with it. And we all live in the valley. So you will eventually get over it. You will learn to climb the mountain again and get to the top at some point.
That's really good.
Mm.
My last question, and then we get to sign off here. It's been a wonderful time with you, Jason, and thank
Thank
you for
you.
sharing your story. Unplug with Mel always has this question at the end. What do you and your family do now in this transition of time to unplug, to reset, to recharge?
Honestly, um, it's community. We're trying to branch out, meaning whether through our church or otherwise, to be able to do that. And it's more trying to have a little more normal family time. Yes, my daughter has needs, but it was my son that was always more medically fragile. So we're trying to do more things as a family right now with my wife and my daughter. Because literally right after my son passed, my wife and I had this exact conversation. We looked at each other and went, do we even know our daughter at this point? Because we were so focused on all the extremes that my son had, that once he passed away and we got through the funeral and the fanfare and all that, we thought, we've got to relearn our daughter. Not that we ignored her, but it was just, we were so ultra focused on other things that we had to understand who our daughter was, what her likes, what her dislikes, all that were.
That's good parenting there to realize that it wasn't intentional that you guys were doing that. It was just the way of life is. But now that you have this new life, new transition of, getting to know each other, even knowing your wife and her knowing you, y'all are different people in that. Grief changes us.
Sure.
And it continues on. Well, I thank you so much for your transparency, for your willingness to come on to tell your story. Our motto here is, to tell your story to inspire infinite growth, because when you begin to tell that story, it lives on forever. And that inspires growth infinitely. It never will go away. So you began that journey today with Unplug with Mel.
Sure.
So, Jason, thank you for your time today. It's been an honor, and I love that I've gotten to see grief colored in a different lens because of your letters to Zachary.
Well, thank you so much. I really appreciate you having me on.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.